Hello there, welcome to Planet America, coming to you from the Situation Room. I'm John Barron.
I'm Licciardello, and once again, we have a situation.
There is absolute evil coming out of the White House. There is absolute evil that is saying that they are going to roll back even the modest steps forward that we took in George Floyd's name.
5 years this week after the death of George Floyd, the backlash against Black Lives Matter. We'll speak to activist and former vice presidential candidate Melina Abdullah.
And President Trump vows to make America healthy again with the help of Bobby Kennedy. Will it work? But first,
President Trump seems to be losing patience with and possibly interest in the war in Ukraine. After months of blaming the Ukrainians for being invaded and being insufficiently grateful for American military support, this week Trump finally had some critical words for the invader.
I don't know what the hell happened to Putin. I've known him a long time, always gotten along with him, but he's sending rockets into cities and killing people, and I don't like it at all, okay?
Trump's comments came after the Russians launched the heaviest aerial bombardment of Ukraine since the war began more than 3 years ago. Dozens of civilians were killed in hundreds of missile and drone strikes against apartments and industrial sites in Kyiv.
In the wake of the attacks, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky released a message on social media saying, "Silence from America, silence from others around the world only encourages Putin. Without truly strong pressure on the Russian leadership, this brutality will not stop."
The attack and perhaps Zelensky's rebuke of the Americans triggered quite the outburst from Trump as he talked to reporters on the tarmac of Morristown Airport in New Jersey.
I don't like what Putin is doing, not even a little bit. He's killing people. And something happened to this guy, and I don't like it.
President Trump seems to be taking the lack of progress in ceasefire talks rather personally. During the presidential campaign, Trump repeatedly boasted about how quickly he would end the war.
And it will take me no longer than one day. I know exactly what to say to each of them. I got along very well with them.
Although, to be fair to Trump, he said he'd end it in one day. He didn't say which one day that would be. It certainly hasn't been in any one of the first 123 days of his presidency. Nevertheless, after weeks of talking up the prospects of a trade deal with Russia, Trump told reporters this week he's now considering stricter sanctions instead. And Senate Republicans are warming to that idea as well. Later on Sunday night, Trump was still apparently fuming over Putin's recalcitrance.
I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He's gone absolutely crazy.
And as he truthed away, Trump wasn't too happy with the Ukrainian president either.
President Zelensky is doing his country no favors by talking the way he does. Everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it, and he better stop.
In a remarkable spray, a petulant-sounding president gave the firmest indication yet he might be about to wash his hands of the whole thing.
This is Zelensky's, Putin's, and Biden's war, not Trump's.
Chaz, it is unusual, to say the least, for an American president to try and distance himself from a conflict after he campaigned on his ability to end it, as it turns out, rather unrealistically quickly.
yes, although this has been coming for a few weeks now, John. You might recall 2 weeks ago, Trump's position was,
Look, nothing's going to happen until Putin and I get together, okay?
and so last week Trump had that big 2-hour phone call with Putin, and he came out of that phone call with this big statement. Russia and Ukraine will immediately start negotiations towards a ceasefire and, more importantly, an end to the war. But Putin wasn't quite so excited. At about the same time that tweet was going out, he was announcing he was ready to propose, well, a memorandum concerning a possible future peace treaty, which would have several provisions, including a framework for resolution of something or other, and a timeline for potentially concluding a peace agreement of some kind, maybe even the possibility of a temporary ceasefire if corresponding agreements are reached, of course. Those are somewhat less ambitious goals, and Trump obviously knew this because in the very same tweet he'd been talking about the end of the war, he also removed himself from the negotiations, saying that negotiations would just be between the two parties from now on because they would know details of a negotiation that nobody else would be aware of. But even though Trump wouldn't be involved, the Pope might be for some reason. Now, do you think I'm being overly negative here? Because Trump soon made it crystal clear.
You said last week that you thought nothing was going to happen, no advances would be made until you and Putin got together. Do you still feel that way?
I think something's going to happen. And if it doesn't, I'd just back away and they're going to have to keep going. Again, this was a European situation. It should have remained a European situation.
Also, after Putin's call, Trump apparently told European leaders on another call that Putin isn't ready to end the Ukraine war because he thinks he's winning. Now, Caroline Levitt disputes those accounts. She says Trump never said Putin isn't ready to end the war. But for what it's worth, one of the officials on that call said that Trump started the call with the words, "I think Vladimir does not want peace." And this is all consistent with reported private conversations that Trump conducted at Mar-a-Lago, where he supposedly said that Putin was particularly tough to negotiate with and that Putin wanted the whole of Ukraine. Having said that, John, there does still appear to be some hope for progress because Europe may have come up with a cunning plan where the US provides Ukraine only the kinds of assistance that Europe can't. In fact, Europe would pay for America's assistance by tapping Russia's confiscated assets. That way, Trump could tell Americans that he has reduced aid for Ukraine without abandoning them and that Europe were the ones footing the bill. The theory then being that Putin might feel motivated to negotiate properly if he thinks that Ukraine is going to be in it and fully armed for the long haul. We shall see.
Indeed we shall. Now to Trump's tariff war with the world. After a short truce, this was the breaking news on Friday.
President Trump saying he wants a straight 50% tariff on the EU beginning June 1st.
Not unreasonably, some European observers pondered if this time he was serious.
Well, it's possible this is a negotiation tactic, but the fact that he is the President of the United States means that it does carry weight and he could just push through with it to prove a point.
Quite so. Trump also threatened a 25% tariff on tech giants, including Apple and Samsung, on phones made outside the United States.
You know, the iPhone, if they're going to sell it in America, I want it to be built in the United States.
That's all despite Apple's announcement back in February they will spend over $500 billion over 4 years in 9 American states. But that investment is not intended to bring iPhone manufacturing to the United States.
And that's not to mention that Apple's Tim Cook personally donated $1 million to Trump's inaugural committee. Jeez, Donald, can't you see the man's trying to bribe you? Pay attention.
I thought he was better at taking bribes than that. Ironically, during that particular press gaggle in the Oval Office, President Trump got a phone call on his foreign-made iPhone.
Universities from taking foreign students.
It's a different congressman. They're all congratulating us. Yeah, it's lucky it is, right?
Not so lucky for investors, though. US stock indexes and European shares fell and the dollar weakened on the latest tariff news. But then, less than 48 hours later, yet another pause, July 9th being the new deadline for those EU tariffs. Still not a lot of time to negotiate a deal, given that that is when most of the world also wants to have a deal with Trump after that 90-day initial freeze, Chaz.
We've got to be clear what happened here, John. There was already a pause on new tariffs against Europe for 90 days that lasted until July 9. But for some reason, Trump decided to end the pause early that was supposed to go till July 9, but then allow Europe a new pause until July 9. I don't know who he thinks he's fooling with all this, but what this does do is add to the general air of uncertainty. We've told you before that Trump has announced new or revised tariff policies more than 50 times this year already, including more than a dozen executive orders. More than a half dozen of those tariff announcements, by the way, didn't even last a week, and he's changed tariffs on goods from China, Canada and Mexico at least half a dozen times each. So if you don't like the current tariff regime, don't worry, it'll be changing soon. And that goes for Apple as well. Now, bear in mind, the only reason Apple moved some of their operations to India in the first place was because Trump incentivized companies to leave China. And as John said, they are making some investments in America as well. In fact, as recently as a month ago, Trump tweeted, this is a great time to move your company into the United States of America, like Apple is doing. Nothing has changed since then, John, except now Trump wants to punish Apple. Not that a 25% tariff is going to change anything anyway, because even if Trump was going to keep his tariffs steady long enough for Apple to respond to them, moving iPhone production to America, that'd make iPhones way more than 25% more expensive. In fact, some experts have estimated an all-American iPhone would go from costing $1,000 to $3,500. So a 25% tariff is not going to make any difference to Apple. It's just going to needlessly make iPhones more expensive. Still, it could be a lot worse. Spare a thought for Samsung. You see, Trump, he can't legally place a tariff on only one company, so he ended up doing this.
Do you have the power to tariff one single company, and why would you want to hurt an American company in that way?
It would be more. It would be also Samsung and anybody that makes that product. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair.
Poor old Samsung's catching a stray bullet, John. It sucks to be them.
Yeah, somewhere there is a lettuce that has lasted longer than Trump's tariff policies. Or Liz Truss. This week marks 5 years since the death of George Floyd, the 46-year-old black man who was unable to breathe after being pinned to the ground in Minneapolis by a police officer with his knee on Floyd's neck and back. Officer Derek Chauvin was later convicted of George Floyd's murder. The killing at the height of the COVID pandemic was filmed, and it set off protests against police brutality all around the world. And George Floyd became a potent symbol of the struggle against racial injustice in all its forms.
What happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks.
Half a decade on, and many of the other symbols of the Black Lives Matter movement that erupted in 2020 have now been erased. Literally, in the case of the yellow letters painted on a street in Washington, D.C., jackhammered up after threats from congressional Republicans that they would withhold funding from the Capitol if they didn't remove the words. And the Trump administration this week has announced that it would abandon efforts to reduce police violence. Well, for more, we're joined by Dr. Melina Abdullah, one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter organisation and vice presidential running mate of independent candidate Cornel West in last year's election. Dr. Abdullah, welcome to the Situation Room. I wonder, looking back 5 years now, sadly, George Floyd was one of only a number of people to be killed at the hands of American police. Why do you think his death resonated globally in such a way?
Well, there are lots of reasons that George Floyd's murder is so significant here and around the world. One is, I think that as we were in the midst of COVID lockdown, when people were being quarantined, it meant that we couldn't look away. And oftentimes it's so painful when we think about police killings of Black people. We look away. We try to shield ourselves in an effort to protect our own souls from what's actually happening. But we couldn't afford to look away. We didn't have the luxury of looking away this time. And so it really conjured up the rage, the righteous rage among Black people and people who care about Black people, and compelled us to get out of our homes and into the streets. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, I think it's because Black Lives Matter had been building. We were born in 2013 and came out into the streets at another watershed moment when the murderer of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was acquitted, that we came out into the streets and pledged to build a movement, not a moment, a movement, not a moment. So for 7 years, we had been building. And of course, a third one would be that his murder is really one of a trio of deaths that occurred during roughly the same time period. First, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia at the hands of white supremacists, one of whom was a former cop. Two was Breonna Taylor, who was killed as a result of a no-knock warrant in Louisville, Kentucky, and then George Floyd is the third. And so there was this kind of building on top of building, and the righteous rage erupts on May 25th of 2020.
And as a society, where do you think America is when it comes to racial issues 5 years after George Floyd? Do you think America is in a better place?
Well, we're at a crossroads and we have to recognize the absolute evil. And I know people don't usually speak in terms of good and evil on news programs, but that's the truth of where we are. There is absolute evil coming out of the White House. There is absolute evil that is saying that they are going to roll back even the modest steps forward that we took in George Floyd's name. There's an executive order that Donald Trump signed called Unleashing Law Enforcement, meaning that law enforcement will not be held accountable. And so the crossroads is, do we just capitulate to Trump's evil? Do we capitulate to what's really fascism, if we think about the political science definition of fascism, or do we fight? Just numerically, in the United States, more people were killed by police in 2024 than any other year on record, and that's as measured by mappingpoliceviolence.us. And so are we going to allow that to be, or are we going to fight back? And I think the answer for most Black people and also freedom-loving people, regardless of race, is let's fight back.
And I wonder, do you think if, in retrospect, that phrase of defunding the police that gained such currency 5 years ago was possibly a mistake? It was distorted and weaponised against Black Lives Matter, and it scared many people who looked to the police for their protection rather than seeing them as a threat.
Well, I know that people from the right wing all the way to liberals within the Democratic Party saw the chant, the clarion call to defund the police as a tremendous threat. But when we began saying defund the police, we began actually using that phrase as early as 2015 with simply a policy demand. It was a budgetary request. It was saying cities like Los Angeles, like Oakland, like New York, like Chicago need to stop spending upwards of 50% of their unrestricted funds on police and instead invest in the things that we know measurably keep communities safe. And when you think about it, from 2015 to 2020, it was not a controversial phrase because people understood by looking at just simple pie charts of the budget that this makes logical sense to invest in housing, to invest in after-school programs, to invest in public health, rather than overspending on police. And if you look objectively at the safest communities are those with the most resources, not the most police.
And finally, how would you respond to conservatives who say that the anti-racist movements of the last 10 years or so divided America more along racial lines because it made Americans even more race conscious and focused than they were before?
What we've done is forced people who've been able to be comfortable with the racial hierarchy, namely white people themselves, to confront racism. And it's much more comfortable for those who are at the top of the racial hierarchy to ignore the race-based oppression that people like me, that Black folks and other people of color experience every single day. So no, the division has been there. The division has been part of our entire history in this country and the history of Black and exploited people around the world. So just because they've been able to ignore it doesn't mean it wasn't there. And so I think it's good and healthy and can move us towards progress when we say, here's the history, here's the challenge, and here's the path towards real reconciliation that can only come when we have truth and restitution and move towards equity and equality.
Dr. Melina Abdullah, thank you for joining us on Planet America's Situation Room.
Thank you so much for having me.
This week, President Trump released the Maha Report, compiled by his Make America Healthy Again Commission. It focuses on what it calls the childhood chronic disease crisis by confronting its root causes, namely poor diet, environmental chemicals, lack of physical activity and chronic stress, and what it calls over-medicalisation, the overprescription of medications, unnecessary treatments with long-term health risks. The report says that more than 1 in 5 American children over the age of 6 are now obese, a 270% increase since the 1970s. At the same time, childhood cancer is up nearly 40%. Teenage depression rates have nearly doubled in a decade, with 3 million high school students seriously considering suicide. And childhood food allergies are up 88% since the late 1990s. And when it comes to autism, President Trump has his own thoughts about the drivers of that.
When you hear 10,000, it was 1 in 10,000, and now it's 1 in 31 for autism. I think that's just a terrible thing. It has to be something on the outside, has to be artificially induced, has to be.
The Maha report makes much of the increased diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders since the 1960s. Happily, it doesn't stray overtly into unscientific and debunked doubts over vaccines, often peddled by Secretary Kennedy. Instead, it notes only a, quote, possible association between the consumption of food colourings and autism. And that possible association is enough for Trump to act.
Already we're phasing out 8 of the most common artificial food dyes.
But when it comes to vaccines, the report raises lots of questions about the number being administered, as well as their safety, concluding there has been limited scientific inquiry into the links between vaccines and chronic disease, the impacts of vaccine injury and conflicts of interest in the development of vaccine schedule.
Yeah, to be fair though, the vaccine and autism sections combined are maybe 3 pages of a 68-page report. The bulk of the report is, as you say, trying to get to the bottom of what the report claims are the 40% of American kids who have at least one chronic health condition: asthma, allergies, obesity, autoimmune diseases or behavioural disorders. The report also noted 75% of American 17 to 24-year-olds are ineligible for military service because of obesity, poor physical fitness or mental health challenges. The report seems to particularly blame what kids are eating. It says nearly 70% of children's calories come from ultra-processed foods, contributing to obesity, diabetes and other chronic conditions. It brings the evidence as well. They cite a 2019 study where participants consumed ultra-processed foods for 2 weeks, followed by 2 weeks of unlimited, unprocessed foods. Despite having identical caloric access in both situations, they consumed roughly 500 fewer calories per day and lost 2 pounds on the unprocessed food diet, while gaining 2 pounds on the ultra-processed food diet. So that's compelling. The report also pointed the finger at the thousands of synthetic chemicals that children are exposed to, the nearly 9 hours of non-school screen time American teens average per day. 9 hours a day! How over 70% of kids and 85% of teens fail to get the recommended 60 minutes of moderate exercise per day. How teens using social media for more than 3 hours per day face double the risk of anxiety and depression, and how antipsychotic prescriptions for children increased by 800% between 1993 and 2009, and the report notes that those drugs are being prescribed for conditions that have not been approved by the FDA for use in children. Now, I suspect many people would share RFK's concerns with the majority of the items on that list I just read out, not to mention the surprisingly large section of the report dedicated to corporate influence, including noting that 0% of interventional nutrition studies funded by the industry report unfavourable health outcomes regarding soft drinks, juices and milk, while 37% of studies backed by non-industry funding did. And it also noted that the pharmaceutical industry spent $4.7 billion on lobbying between 1999 to 2018, more than any other industry. And finally, it noted that 9 out of the last 10 FDA commissioners and about 70% of the FDA's medical reviewers had gone on to work for the pharmaceutical industry. Interesting. So overall, I personally thought the report, it did have lots of interesting stuff in it and potentially valuable stuff. But firstly, there are definitely parts that are dedicated to RFK's quirky obsessions.
Yes.
No doubt. You mentioned some of them. I'll throw in also, in the chemical section, he gives his concerns about fluoride a mention, which, yeah, that's fine, there are concerns, but he didn't even mention that fluoride also protects against tooth cavities, which is a pretty important part of fluoride. Yeah. And the other weakness of that report is that it's long on complaints, short on solutions. Now, this is intentional. RFK has said that this report was meant to be a diagnosis, whereas his next report is meant to serve as a prescription So, John, that may well be where the rubber hits the road. I'm certainly looking forward to that next report in a few months' time.
Yes, and that road could be leading us all the way to Crazy Town if RFK is at the wheel.
Well, Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill is currently on its way to the Senate, along with some significant spending cuts, including to the Medicaid healthcare program for lower-income Americans. As Melina explains, this could also impact Americans seeking treatment for opioid addiction.
Overdose deaths in America have dropped 27% in the past year. That's 30,000 fewer deaths. Amazing. Now let's wrap this segment up early before we get any bad news.
Advocates helping people recover from substance use fear that proposed Medicaid cuts will put many lives at risk. U.S. House Republicans recently passed a budget resolution calling for cutting at least $2 trillion in spending.
Oh. Medicaid covered 35% of people treated for opioid use disorder in 2021. And it's one of the key programs being targeted for massive budget cuts. Other programs to reduce overdose deaths also face an uncertain future. Trump's draft budget cuts a $56 million annual grant for Narcan, the opioid overdose reversal medication that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And the main federal agency addressing drug use has seen half its workers fired. Plus, it's about to be collapsed into a new organization.
We're going to eliminate an entire alphabet soup of departments and agencies while preserving their core functions by merging them into a new organization called the Administration for a Healthy America, or AHA.
AHA. RFK Jr. is so into efficiency, he's cut his favorite acronym by 25%. These cuts aren't happening because Kennedy doesn't care about drug addicts. He's been open about his own struggle with 14 years of heroin addiction. And that informs his strong views about how to tackle the problem, especially for young people.
And I was at the bottom of my class. I started doing heroin. I went to the top of my class.
Oops, wrong clip.
Banning cell phones in school is one of the things that we need to do to remedy addiction, not just all the standard nuts and bolts things.
I don't know, it's pretty hard to inject fentanyl if your hands are busy scrolling through videos of unlikely animal friends. But those standard nuts and bolts things to treat addiction do save lives. To be fair, Kennedy does acknowledge the need for medications like methadone that have been shown to reduce drug mortality rates by 50%. But he places far more emphasis on 12-step and similar programs that often shun those medical treatments. And while a 27% reduction in drug overdose deaths in 1 year is a remarkable public health achievement, there's still a lot of work to do. 80,000 people died from overdoses last year, and it remains the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 44. So now might not be the time to cut a whole lot of funding, just as overdose prevention strategies are starting to work. Because money for standard nuts and bolts things is probably more important than whether your organization is called MAGA or MAHA or whatever.
That's it for Planet America. We'll see you back here at the slightly later time of 9:25 p.m. on ABC TV next Wednesday night.
And we'll be back for the weekend edition this Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on ABC News. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.